Yeah, move aside Cranky, a new generation of Kong has arrived. Complete with a boombox and killer dance moves, this was the new cool. Oh, by the way, I see y'all enjoying that Super Mario Bros. Movie. What do you think, past Mentalk from my old apartment?
Boy, I'm actually surprised the Mario movie turned out to be this great. Back to you, Mentalk from the other timeline that decided to move.
I promise to cover all the new lore within it once it's digitally released or something, but in the meantime, let's get back to Donkey Kong. I recommend anyone who's a sucker for things in chronological order to check out the video on classic Donkey Kong first. Otherwise, welcome to Origin Oracle. Join me as we discover how Nintendo transitioned from the classic DK formula into the modern, and how this ape established several new successful series within his franchise. Anyway, kick back, grab some snacks in either order, and let's head back in time.
I'd shower you with coconut cream pies.
This rebranded version of Donkey Kong debuted in the highly successful Super Nintendo title, Donkey Kong Country, released worldwide in November 1994. Nintendo handed off the development of the series to the legendary studio Rare Ltd. But before we get to them, let's talk about the in-game introduction to Donkey Kong first. Aside from that timeless intro, the game throws you right in with the first level being Jungle Hijinks. The player can just run off into the jungle at that point and start the game. Or you can backtrack a little bit to a cave at the beginning of the level that turns out to be the banana stash of the Kongs. It's been completely cleared out, which makes the Kongs visibly upset, and we'll see many future titles with bananas serving as DK's damsel in distress, which is also joked about in the manual, by the way. Speaking of which, the intro to Donkey Kong Country may be simple with the plot details, but the instructions manual is a whole different beast. I was surprised to see 4 full pages of text for the story alone in this manual, but I was equally excited because, you know, content. So within these pages, we learn that our story takes place on Donkey Kong Island, home to Donkey Kong alongside his family and friends. Our hero lives in a treehouse right above the largest stash of bananas in the jungle, and arguably the world. Right before retiring for the night, he asks Diddy, a small spider monkey, to serve as the night watch for the horde of bananas. So quick side note, as a kid when I played Donkey Kong Country, I always had this assumption that DK and Diddy were the best of friends. But reading this manual, I feel like I'm a little mistaken. Cause check this out. Okay, little buddy, Donkey had said in his patronizing voice. As part of your hero training, you gotta stand guard tonight over my bananas. I'll relive you at midnight, buddy. Yeah, right. Now he was alone. So Donkey Kong might be somewhat of a f***boy. And as you guys probably guessed, Diddy gets jumped in the middle of the night by a reptilian race known as the Kremlings. And not only do they stuff poor Diddy inside a barrel, but they also clean out Donkey Kong's entire banana stash. DK is woken up in the morning by a frantic Cranky Kong, who ends up laughing at his misfortune as they discover the bananas and Diddy are missing. Diddy's obsession with being like me has gone too far. He may be a long way from being a true video game hero, but he had the guts, the reflexes, the heart. You know, I can't help but wonder if this characterization was meant to be a response to Sonic. Sonic & Knuckles released only a few weeks before this game, and the industry figures at the time were calling the two games a battle between lock-on technology and 3D rendered graphics. So I may be onto something with this. I'll talk about why these graphics were groundbreaking for the industry at the time, but let's finish up with the manual here first. So Donkey Kong's adventure to save his bananas and Diddy begins, and this story gives much more context to Diddy struggling to escape this barrel at the start of the first level. Cranky is also sure to remind us that we're only reading this story because we're bored. So shout out to everyone that used to read these on the toilet. This was definitely much more fun than the chemicals in your shampoo. By the way, the Game Boy re-release for Donkey Kong Country actually has full cutscenes for all the events I just explained. I figured I'd mention this because I just found this out,
and it could have saved me some time on editing.
But let's move on. Now I gave the short version of the story here, but I also found out the original story was 15 whole pages until Nintendo voted to condense it down. So as you can see, this was a different kind of Donkey Kong that didn't take itself very seriously. Rare injected a lot of fourth wall breaking humor and meta jokes into the series, like references to Cranky Kong's arcade days, DK being referred to as a video game hero, or the fact that this game doesn't have a princess that needs to be saved. But the gameplay itself managed to keep things simple. With these fancy 3D rendered graphics, Donkey Kong was now starring in a full platformer. I just found it poetic that the original Donkey Kong arcade game is credited as one of the very first platforming games, and here we have Donkey Kong Country owning the genre once again. So as Donkey Kong heads out into the jungle to recover his bananas, you find the trapped Diddy Kong pretty quickly. I gotta take a second to say that this right here is great game design, because not only is the barrel violently shaking, you hear distressed monkey noises coming from within it. If you are completely unfamiliar with this game, at this point in time, you already know that this barrel can be interacted with from both the audio and visual cues. So at this stage, the player is probably asking themselves how they can break it open. You can try jumping on it, but that won't work. So maybe there's another button to, aha! DK can lift barrels and throw them. So congratulations, you've now learned how to perform one of the most important mechanics in the game. And right after that, you're introduced to Diddy Kong, who will be your adventuring companion for the remainder of the game. You can even play as him, but let me not say too much because homie's getting his own video. But unlike Mario games up to this point, you don't just clear these stages, you attempt to fully complete them by collecting bananas, the letters of Kong littered throughout each stage, balloons for additional lives, and animal tokens. And each level is dense with collectibles and hidden paths, which gives Donkey Kong Country a huge replayability factor. So while Donkey and Diddy go off on their adventure, let's discuss how this game came about. We gotta go even further back in time to the early 1980s in the United Kingdom. Queen Elizabeth II is still the queen, Michael Jackson released Billie Jean at some point, and these two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper, are finding some success in game development. They're part of a development company known as Ultimate Play the Game, responsible for home computer titles like Jetpack and Saberwolf. And these games would offer Ultimate Play the Game some success. Before the release of the Famicom, which would eventually become the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West, Ultimate Play the Game was mostly developing games for the ZX Spectrum, which was the most popular microcomputer in Britain at that time. But the Spectrum didn't seem like a great avenue for growth in the market, and the employees at Ultimate Play the Game started to realize it would reach a dead end if they kept tailoring their software to it. Enter the Famicom. The company believed that it was a much better piece of hardware, and it would be the best choice for their games moving forward. The brothers would kindly ask Nintendo for the programming specs needed to create Nintendo games, to which Nintendo politely replied,
"Go fuck yourself."
I had to subscribe to Bloomberg to confirm this information in one of their old-ass 90s articles, so that must deserve a like or something. So after their rejection from Nintendo, the brothers would found Rare in 1985, and the focus would be to reverse engineer the Famicom console to learn what made it tick. This process took them 8 months, and once it was complete, they marched back to Nintendo in Kyoto to show off to Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa that not only did they reverse engineer the system, but they could make impressive technical demos for it as well. Arakawa was impressed and granted the Stamper brothers a Nintendo developer license and an unlimited budget for games for the Famicom. So with their success, they moved their office to Twycross in England and established a US headquarters in Miami, Florida. And I never thought my hometown would be relevant in any of these videos. Rare would go on to develop over 60 NES titles, one of their most popular being Battletoads. And Battletoads gained them enough notoriety to even get a crossover with another hit beat-em-up series, Double Dragon. So by the time the Super Nintendo was on the horizon, Rare was already a well-known developer, if not the biggest developer from the UK. So instead of going all in on creating games for the Super Nintendo, they heavily invested their profits into the Challenge workstations instead. These were a family of supercomputers in the early 90s, created by Silicon Graphics, which Rare required for their development teams to research 3D modeling. And to put it in perspective, these were the same machines that would help to get Jurassic Park on the big screen in 1993. Rare even needed to order a massive air conditioning unit just to make sure the machines didn't overheat. By the way, it cost Rare £80,000 for each of these Challenge workstations, so let's adjust that for inflation. You're looking at around £183,000 or $227,000 US today in 2023. Get me a computer that costs that much today and it could probably edit these videos for me, and then maybe I can get my life back. So with Nintendo and Sega at the peak of their console war in 1993, there was essentially a space race between the two companies to see who could pioneer the most groundbreaking game experience.
You can't do this on Nintendo, Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
Luckily for Nintendo, Rare was experimenting with 3D graphics on a boxing game called Brute Force. And after a demonstration, Nintendo wanted a game that used that technology. Something to compete with the gorgeous Aladdin game on the Sega Genesis. And I'm with Nintendo on this one, that game slaps. Tim Stamper would go on to suggest the idea of creating a new platform game for the Super Nintendo that used pre-rendered 3D graphics, taking some inspiration from how they used digitized footage in Mortal Kombat. Nintendo would then officially grant Rare permission to revive the Donkey Kong franchise. And while it's somewhat debated whether Rare was given the choice on which character to use, Donkey Kong Country would still become one of the most successful game titles from the 90s.
I wanna know the secrets that the crystal holds and all the magic power that it brings.
Finally, we're at the part of the story where Donkey Kong gets his redesign. Rare had a team of 12 working on their new title, led by Greg Mayles. Nintendo gave Rare space to do their work for the most part, but Miyamoto did have some involvement during development, advising the team on how to improve the game and some of the designs. He even suggested the implementation of DK's hand slap move, which can be used to defeat enemies. Funny enough, one of Rare's early pitches actually had Wario as the villain. Yeah, the game would have opened up with Mario finishing designing some type of time machine, and then Wario ambushes him with some gun that turns Mario to stone, and then some parrot that's living with Mario goes off to tell Donkey Kong, and then that kind of just starts the adventure. But this idea was scrapped by Nintendo since they wanted to feature a brand new villain in Donkey Kong Country this time around. The man in charge of the redesign for Donkey Kong was Kevin Bayliss, who's pretty active on Twitter these days, by the way. Some of the concept art you'll see in this video more than likely came from him, but Nintendo made sure to fax reference material his way to keep the redesign up to their standards, like the red tie introduced in Donkey Kong 94 being kept for his new model. Aside from that, Bayliss wanted to make the new look feel believable and easy to animate, drawing inspiration from his previous work on Battletoads. And while he initially took a bulkier approach to the redesign, suggestions from Nintendo would lead Bayliss to the end result we see across the series to this day. Diddy Kong would be introduced as a side character that would serve somewhat as an extra life for players, being able to take the hit for Donkey if he was damaged or vice versa. He would also provide the player with some much needed company on the adventure. So to gain inspiration, Rare ended up taking a trip to the zoo to gain an idea of what realistic gorilla movements might look like. But they determined that their movements would be a little too slow for their gameplay, and based DK's movements on the gallop of a horse instead. On the development side, the team went through sleepless nights, mapping out entire levels using post-it notes. Greg Mayles said, quote, "The thing I really remember from that project was the immense struggle of reducing the massive SGI rendered images to a really small size. It was like a giant jigsaw puzzle. All the levels were designed on post-it notes and stuck together. We'd come up with ideas for a level, say swinging ropes, draw them all out on post-it notes, and stick them together in the order we wanted them to be used. That's how every single level was designed. The team would reportedly work 12 hours per day throughout the week to get this game done. So despite the development crunch here, the game would release to be an overwhelming success, setting the record for the fastest selling video game at that time. They would manage to move over 500,000 copies within a week, with some media outlets declaring it the best game of 1994. Sonic fan within me has to disagree.
You good, bro?
Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's check in on DK and Diddy. So they managed to track down the leader of the Kremlings, King K. Rool. Get it? Cruel? And after taking him down, we're treated to, in my opinion, one of the greatest fake outs in an old school game. K. Rool gets right back up after the credits roll, and the battle continues with a slight increase in difficulty. But ultimately, DK and Diddy are the victors. They managed to recover the bananas and return them to their horde, ending the very first Donkey Kong Country. This game would open the door to a sequel title starring Diddy Kong, who has to save a captive DK, and a third title starring members of the extended Kong tribe that I'll discuss in other videos. I'm 2,500 words in and I'm way behind schedule. But don't sleep on Donkey Kong Country's handheld counterpart, Donkey Kong Land for the Game Boy. I assure you, it's its own thing, and the soundtrack equally amazing for an 8-bit title, also composed by the renowned David Wise. This game actually has its own story, and it's phrased as a sequel to Donkey Kong Country. It involves Cranky complaining to DK and Diddy that the reason everybody enjoyed Donkey Kong Country is because of all the fancy graphics. So DK and Diddy make a bet with Cranky that their game would be just as successful on an 8-bit system like the Game Boy. They even decide to call up King K. Rool to come steal their bananas again to give them a reason for an adventure. That is literally the plot to this game. That should be reason enough for you guys to play this game, but if you're looking for something old school, go ahead and check this one out. But before I move on from the OG Donkey Kong Country games, we have to talk about the TV series. I've sprinkled clips of this throughout the video, and the internet kinda loves to dunk on this one, but let's see who was behind this. The series follows the adventures of Donkey Kong, who is declared the future ruler of Congo Bongo Island.
Why do I always have to start the day with a tough decision?
He's chosen by the magical artifact, the Crystal Coconut, which is connected to a spirit known as Inka Dinka Doo, and all of this is established before the series even begins. King K. Rool is the main villain in this series as well, and is of course after that Crystal Coconut during the course of the series. This all started with a French animation studio named Media Lab, which managed to obtain rights from Nintendo for 13 episodes of a Donkey Kong Country animated series. Media Lab would approach Canada's largest animation studio, Nelvana, to assist with getting the show off the ground. This would actually be in response to Media Lab firing the original writers. One of the writers of the series, Erica Strobel, stated that the original scripts produced by the fired writers had racist and sexist jokes that were inappropriate for a kids show within it. So Media Lab was using new technology to create a computer animated show with the help of motion capturing, or as the studio called it at the time, performance animation. This is one of the very first shows to use motion capture tech for animation, and while this kind of technology was cutting edge, it came with quite a few limitations. And due to this, animators had to limit the number of new locations that were featured in the show or new characters implemented into the series. Interestingly enough, this show debuted in France back in September 1996 and wouldn't officially air in the US until August of '98. They managed to produce 40 episodes which ran until the summer of 2000. So this show did air for quite some time. And while the animation may not hold up so well, some of the songs featured in this show are still bangers to this day.
An absolute zero, I'm nobody's hero. Autograph picture of my idol King Kong, or my tickets to the Dingling Brothers circus show.
So if you're wondering why there's so many songs in this show, Erica was actually asked about this too, and her response was, why were the songs included? That wasn't Nelvana's idea. It was Media Lab. The French wanted song sequences. Why? I do not know. I thought it was bizarre. But to the songwriter's credit, they wrote some pretty funny lyrics. It was two guys, Pure West, that wrote all the songs and the opening theme for DK. They were pretty brilliant. As for Erica, she would continue to write for a number of shows, the most popular being Total Drama Island. But unfortunately, in March 2017, she would lose her long-running battle with depression. But on a positive note, it's safe to say many will look back on her works and remember a much simpler time in their lives.
Here we go.
So as we progress into the late 90s, Rare would return to make Donkey Kong's next official title once again, Donkey Kong 64. Released in November 1999, bringing the Kongs over to a fully 3D experience. And once again, this intro is timeless. Through the DK rap, we're reintroduced to Donkey Kong and his entire crew, complete with brand new playable Kongs to join him on his new adventure. The plot isn't too different from the others, with DK's bananas and friends being stolen once again by the Kremlings and King K. Rool. This time they have a weapon of mass destruction known as the Blast-O-Matic that they plan to use to destroy the DK Isles. So it's up to Donkey Kong to find his friends, his golden bananas, and to stop the Kremlings from their conquest. Much of Rare's team this time around would be different from the staff that developed the original Donkey Kong Country games, and while at the time it was positively received, over the years fans have looked at this game a little more critically, criticizing it for its overall bloat, the overutilization of collectibles, and its tedious minigames. Regardless, this would be Rare's final Donkey Kong title before they were officially purchased by Microsoft, leaving the Donkey Kong Country series untouched for 11 whole years. And then?
Retro Studios in Texas has produced some great Metroid titles. But when they said they were ready for something new, we asked them to take one of the most treasured franchises in video game history and to make it magic again. If you listen, you can hear it coming.
And after a decade of waiting, the next Donkey Kong Country title would be Donkey Kong Country Returns for the Nintendo Wii in 2010. This would be followed up by Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze for the Wii U, released in 2014. These games were developed by Retro Studios, best known for the Metroid Prime series, and until further notice, the Donkey Kong Country series still seems to be in their care to this day. These games are fantastic, introducing new gameplay mechanics while keeping the old intact, gorgeous new level themes to go with the power of the new consoles at the time, and the music for both titles carries the same atmospheric jungle vibes from the original games with some outstanding remixes from the original soundtracks. They even brought back David Wise to compose for Tropical Freeze, and in my opinion, it's his best work. But in Nintendo fashion, they simplified the Donkey Kong lore considerably, at least in comparison to when Rare was at the head with all the new characters they introduced. But Donkey Kong Country Returns does bring in a new set of villains known as the Tiki Tak Tribe, who hypnotize the animals of Donkey Kong Island and steal the bananas once again. The sequel, Tropical Freeze, changes the banana in distress formula a little bit and introduces a group of Viking villains known as the Snowmads, who attempt to conquer Donkey Kong Island by summoning an ice dragon, on DK's birthday no less.
Wow, what an asshole.
After being blown away by the ice dragon, the Kongs go off on another adventure to return to their island and reclaim their home from the Snowmads. And if you have a Nintendo Switch, I highly suggest grabbing the revamped Tropical Freeze. It doesn't pull its punches on difficulty and truly tests your platforming skills.
But Mentalk, how could you skip over 11 years of Donkey Kong games?
Okay, let's rewind the clock a little bit. Donkey Kong didn't technically go missing after Donkey Kong 64. Of course, he was very present within Mario spin-offs, sports titles, and served as a major character within the Super Smash Bros. Series. But there were a few new games that spawned starring this modern Donkey Kong that filled the gaps between the mainline country titles. Like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, a spiritual successor to the Donkey Kong Game Boy title. This was developed for the Game Boy Advance and released in the summer of 2004. Originally, this was supposed to be an updated version of the Game Boy Donkey Kong entitled Donkey Kong Plus, and players would have been able to design and create levels on the GameCube, which could then be transferred back to the Game Boy Advance via a link cable. But instead, Nintendo released Mario vs. Donkey Kong, pitting the two against each other once again. The story features Mario as the owner of his own toy company where he sells toy versions of himself in the Mushroom Kingdom. Mario is full of himself and I will never be convinced otherwise. Donkey Kong sees the toy in a TV commercial and decides to go buy one, only to find out that they're sold out. I know DK, I've been there. But in his rage, he breaks into Mario's factory and steals all of the mini Marios. So this is the main conflict of the game, and it leads to Mario pursuing him to get all of the toys back. And once you beat the final boss stage, Donkey Kong breaks down in sadness, but the game ends on a wholesome note as Mario gives him his own free mini Mario. The level setup and gameplay is very similar to Game Boy Donkey Kong, where you find keys to open locked doors to get to the next stage, along with the occasional DK boss fight. The gameplay is simple, but this is a lot of fun, and I think it's still the best in the series. Yes, series. There are 6 other Mario vs. Donkey Kong titles. But the gameplay changes rather drastically after the first game, with the player controlling mini Marios to obtain keys and solve puzzles instead. In the second game, we even see Pauline make her first return since 1994, as she gets kidnapped by the new DK this time around, enraged since Pauline seems to like the Mario toy better than his new mini Donkey Kong toy. We discover in these games that Donkey Kong has a very short temper, since most of them start with him getting pissed off at something minor before kidnapping Pauline. There are also a couple of other handheld puzzle games starring Donkey Kong that are now collectively referred to as the DK series. The first is called DK, King of Swing, released for the Game Boy Advance in 2005. Donkey Kong and his friends are holding a festival called the Jungle Jam, where they collect medals as prizes during contests involving barrel breaking and climbing. King K. Rool comes to spoil the fun by stealing all the medals, so it's up to Donkey Kong to get them back. The gameplay is a little different from other DK titles we've seen up to this point, with the players swinging and climbing with Donkey Kong along pegboards to get him to the top of the level. Once you've completed all the levels in a world, you can face the boss and move on to the next set of levels. Oh, and look, the crystal coconuts from the television series make an appearance. There was one other title in the series known as DK Jungle Climber, this time on the Nintendo DS, keeping the same gameplay mechanics. I really prefer the art style from the original since the cuter aesthetic seems to fit the lower stakes. While these games are published on handheld, there is another set of Donkey Kong games on the GameCube. Donkey Konga, a rhythm game where you get to play the bongos alongside DK and Diddy, complete with its own special controller called the DK Bongos, and who are you if you haven't tried to play Smash Bros. With this thing? I know you're wondering about the gripping story and lore of Donkey Konga, so here goes. Donkey Kong and Diddy find some mysterious bongos one day while chilling at the beach, so they take them to Cranky, who explains what bongos are. The two try to play them and magic bongos! So the two of them have it in their heads that if they play these well enough, then they can go on to afford as many bananas as they could eat. So let the practice begin. And that's pretty much it. In the actual game, you play these drums to songs from Nintendo franchises like Mario and Zelda, but of course, there's licensed music as well.
Make a big noise playing in the street. Gonna be a big man someday. You got mud on your face.
Nintendo made sure they were able to get mileage out of these drums though, because this game got 2 sequels, Donkey Konga 2 and Donkey Konga 3, which was a Japanese exclusive. This is the only game where you'll get to see Donkey Kong jamming out to the Naruto soundtrack. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat was somewhat of a follow-up to this series, released in 2005 for the GameCube, but this time it was a platformer that also supported the DK Bongos. There's really no story to talk about here other than DK just going on a rampage to become the king of the jungle. Interestingly enough, this project was directed by Yoshiaki Koizumi, and this was the last game made by this team before they would go on to develop Super Mario Galaxy. And how could I forget Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, a kart racer for the Nintendo Wii? This would be Donkey Kong's first and last kart racer, and it's still crazy to me that Diddy got one before he did. But let's save that story for another video. In this title, Donkey Kong and his friends race through the skies on rocket-powered bongos, and much like Mario Kart, you're able to use items to trip up the competition. But you're probably wondering why they chose rocket-powered bongos as the vehicles here. Why not just regular carts? Well, you can also use the DK Bongos to play this game. One whole console later, and Nintendo was still trying to put these things to good use. So I don't have a lot of experiences with this game, so if you guys have played this or even used the Bongos controller while playing it, let me know in the comments below. I want to know if there are positive experiences. When I started this video, I didn't think this would end up being the second longest script I've written so far, but here we are. So let's end this with the latest version of Donkey Kong, featured in the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Even though I plan to make a video covering all the new versions of the characters within this film, it wouldn't have felt right if I didn't mention it at all. So, minor spoilers for the Mario movie. Donkey Kong is voiced by Seth Rogen in this film and is introduced as the son of Cranky Kong, the leader of the Jungle Kingdom. I covered the son and grandson debate in the last DK video, so let's not retread that ground. But in this movie, Mario, Peach, and Toad travel to the Jungle Kingdom to form an alliance with the Kongs for their fight against Bowser. Cranky agrees to lend them the strength of the Kong army, but under one condition. Mario must defeat Donkey Kong in a duel. So Mario and DK are instant rivals once again, this time on the big screen. And this leads to quite a few callbacks to the original Donkey Kong, and there are even minor adjustments to his current design that make him look like a mixture of both the modern and classic renditions. Miyamoto has stated these design changes were made to make DK look a little more comedic in nature. There were credible rumors back in 2021 that Nintendo and Illumination were already planning on a follow-up Donkey Kong movie. While this hasn't been 100% confirmed, I'd say this is a safe bet considering the amount of world building that went into the Jungle Kingdom and the Kongs in this movie. So while Mario has gotten a lot of hype this year, I foresee some focus is coming for this classic, cherished Nintendo character. With Tropical Freeze turning 10 years old next year, it's only a matter of time until we see what's next for Donkey Kong. Maybe a little something to coincide with the Donkey Kong expansion coming to Universal Studios Japan in 2024. There are rumors of a minecart ride that will allow park guests to experience the chaos of these minecart levels from Donkey Kong Country. And of course, there's the opportunity to walk through the jungle where the Kongs reside. So I hope you've enjoyed this extensive two-part look at the history of Donkey Kong, and I know I missed a lot of stuff. This character has so much going on. But feel free to share in the comments your favorite experiences with our boy DK, and until next time, be safe. The Prophet has spoken.